Good evening. Tonight we're going to be speaking about the king of monsters, Godzilla, or shall we say, Gojira. We will be examining an article that explores the evolution of Godzilla from a cathartic cultural experience to a post-war and even modern social phenomenon. And we're going to explore this all tonight on Mysterious Library.
Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to Mysterious Library on the Untold Radio Network. I'm one of your librarians, Dean Bertram, and joining me is the always handsome and astute and just all plain round marvelous Jason McLean.
Well, howdy, Dean. I don't know how I can possibly live up to that intro.
Well, you live up to it every day just by being you, Jason.
Darn Skippy, I do. Darn Skippy. Real quick, just because I would like to thank you for putting that up. So I was going to mention Gojira, the proper name for Godzilla in the opening, but I saw Horace's comment just as I went up. That's where or should we say Gojira came from. I saw him like, dang it, that's too good a line not to use for the intro on this one. So thank you, Horace.
It's always wonderful to know that Horace is with us, as Tim is with us, and as is Joe Fox. So
howdy,
thank
all.
you for joining us and everybody else out there in the chat. This is going to be a fun one tonight, I think. So if people want to chime in the chat, tonight would be a good one, I think, to chime in on. Any of you Godzilla fans out there? Maybe we get it wrong with our analysis. I don't know.
Hey, you know what? I secretly, very publicly, unironically love the Blue Oyster Cult Go Go Godzilla song. So, yeah, I have to admit, when we started this show, at no point was it my master plan to work in a discussion about Godzilla.
But
it has now become like at some point along, I was like, we're going to talk about Godzilla, and I'm going to make it happen. Here we are.
Yes, we're going down the Godzilla path tonight.
Yes.
The Kaiju. Is it Kaiju or Kaiju? How do you pronounce Kaiju, the monster movie?
And again, I'm a Texan. I've never pronounced anything correctly in my life. But yes, Kaiju is the more anglicized version anyway. So
who doesn't love a good Japanese monster movie? And if you love a good Japanese monster movie, chances are most of all you're going to love the king of the monsters, Godzilla.
Of course. It doesn't get any better than Godzilla. I remember they re-released the original Japanese version of Godzilla, and it came to the US finally. My dad was like the first one to buy it because he loved Godzilla. My love of comics and monster movies and all that all came from my dad. Like, he loved those things. And I can honestly tell you, like, I grew up on the Raymond Burr version of it, but I remember watching, sitting down and watching the true original Japanese version and thinking, this is a very different film, right? So again, I'm a huge old school Godzilla fan from as early back as I can remember. So yeah, I'm thrilled with this one.
Well, this one was all you, Jason. In fairness, this was
Yes.
your choice. I went back and revisited the Godzilla movies. I'll be honest, I'm
Mhm.
I'm not a fan of the Godzilla movies, but I never have considered myself a Godzilla fan. I mean,
I
I'm
get it.
kind of, I suppose, conscious of them. I've seen a number of them over the years, but I went back and
Mhm.
watched that original. 1954 is the
Yeah.
first one, right?
Yes, it is.
So I went
Mhm.
back and watched that with my daughter, who's 7, and she was just mesmerized. Now, it was subtitled, and
Mhm.
I was reading the subtitles to her, and I think that made it all the more intriguing for her. The director was Ishirō Honda, right, who directed
Yeah.
that first
Mhm.
movie. And then on your recommendation, I watched the new Shin Godzilla, which was it 2016, that film? Is that right?
Yeah, I think
Something like
so.
that, 2016, 2014. There's been so many Godzilla films, of course, over the last
Oh, yeah.
over the history of cinema since the 1950s, but over the last, 10 years, we seem to have been drowning in Godzilla movies. There was that one where
Yeah.
Heisenberg fought Godzilla, right, from
Yeah.
Breaking Bad?
When they brought when Legendary did sort of the American
Yeah.
relaunch, and I again, I like them. I like the sort of Legendary movies more or less. This Godzilla versus Kong, I was not really in love with, but it's fine. But I just prefer the Japanese Godzilla films.
We don't even have to talk about those American reboots because I have seen the one where Walter White,
Mhm.
Heisenberg, Bryan Cranston was meant to fight Godzilla in the trailer. That's
Yeah.
what I was led to believe, and then he's this minor character,
And then
and I
he's
was
just gone in like the
so
first 10
disappointed,
minutes. Yeah. Oh,
so
everyone was
disappointed.
mad. Yeah.
But that
Everyone
said,
hated that.
I haven't watched any of the post Godzillas, like who was the
Mhm.
guy the Adam Wingard directed a couple of them, like the
Mhm.
Godzilla versus Kong one, and I think he
It
also
it's
it,
yeah, if you
th-
don't
th-
watch them, you haven't missed anything.
I haven't seen any of them. What I am intrigued by though is, which I think we will talk about tonight a little bit, is they have some of the other monsters in some of those later American
Yes.
Godzilla movies, like
Mhm.
Mothra, for
Yeah.
example.
Yeah, in King of the Monsters, where he fights Ghidorah. We've got Rodan, we've got Mothra, we've got a, several others in there that he doesn't really confront. Everyone kept looking for like the old school like Anguirus and a few others, but they replaced them with these others. I think Toho wouldn't let them use like some of they only let them use those three. So the rest were sort of made for them. But again, we don't see him really fight them. Again, if you don't see any of them, you're fine. Like I vastly prefer the Japanese Godzilla movies, the Toho proper. Even like Netflix has a bunch of them that have come out on in like animated that are I think vastly superior. Godzilla Singular Point, I'm not in love with how he looks at the end, but it's still a darn good Godzilla show, right? I mean, he's seen very much a resurgence since 2000. He absolutely has, and we're getting some amazing films. That again, we can explore a little bit later on in the show. But yeah, we're in a golden age of Godzilla again, and I love it.
Well, what was striking for me going back and watching the first one, which I might have seen before, I can't even remember. Like I said, I'd seen a number over the years, but it felt
Hmm.
fairly fresh to me. I obviously hadn't watched it in well over a decade or
Yeah.
two if I'd ever seen
Hmm.
it. Is before I even read the article that you suggested we kind of bounce off, I wanted to watch that and Shin Godzilla first. And what you're most struck by when you watch that original 1954 one is how
Hmm.
clearly this movie is about the Japanese coming to terms with what happened to them at Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Oh
Like
yeah.
the devastation in the movie, the scenes of people in
Hmm.
hospital, the idea of the country having to rally together, the idea of there being a type of nuclear or atomic origin story to Godzilla
Hmm.
rising from the depths and on a mission to destroy Japan. It all is so clearly a reflection of where the Japanese psyche still clearly would have been in
Oh, absolutely.
1954.
Well, I mean, even the design of Godzilla himself, again, originally Gojira, even the design of the costume is meant to elicit the idea that he's been traumatized by the nuclear testing in the Pacific, right? Because he's not covered in scales in the original film. Now, later on, they do make him more. When Godzilla sort of becomes this, um, sort of a spokesperson for Japan, right? Sort of a mascot. it does become scales, right? But it's still an odd texture, but it sort of morphs into scales. When in an original film, they're keloid scars, from the atomic testing. Like he is a damaged creature. Even I was the article that we were sort of reading, even sort of mentions, I never would have thought about it this way, but I've read other people talk about this. The Godzilla scream that we're all so universally familiar with really isn't a roar the way we think of it with like a lion or a dragon. It's more of a cry of pain, right? It even kind of sounds like it's something that's in pain. And that's sort of what he is, right? In the original film, he is the living embodiment of the power of atomic weapons. The article does talk about how his head even kind of looks like a mushroom cloud. I think that's taking it a little far, but it's probably not a wrong example. But that he's this living embodiment of of atomic horror, but also he's also a living embodiment of the pain of atomic horror. Like he's both at the same time. He is both vengeful spirit and mournful spirit at this, wrapped into one. And it's a really, again, his origin in 1954 is just, you watch that movie and you realize virtually everyone who's watching this film lived through that, right? I mean, it's 1954, if you're over 10 years old, you lived through all that. You lived through the fire bombings of Tokyo, and which, a lot of people, everyone focuses on the atomic nature, the atomic, Nagasaki, Hiroshima, and that's fair. However, when he's just destroying these cities and they sort of pan back and you see the fire, right? That's the firebombing of Tokyo. That is not just atomic, the dropping of nuclear weapons, which that scene is, I think, perfectly recreated in Shin Godzilla, which we'll come back to in a little bit. But yeah, 1954's Gojira is it was meant to sort of be this sort of national catharsis, a way of addressing what had happened and where they've been as through this metaphor of this radioactive keloid scarred monster.
And for those watching or listening who want to know what the article is, because I didn't actually put it in the show notes, I should go back and put it in there. I wasn't sure how much you were going to reference it, but the article is called Godzilla, in brackets 1954, Reconfiguring National Trauma into National Symbol. And that's on Broadly Specific website. And the author is Bondun Shiamzu, which I'm sure I'm mispronouncing. But anyway, go to broadlyspecific.com and look for that Godzilla article. I'm pretty sure it's not that hard to find.
Yeah. No, it's one of many, many articles written on this topic. Like, this is not virtually every article you read is going to kind of have the same flavor. Because I think at this point, we're all very aware of what Gojira was, right? As far as dealing with that trauma. And again, what it's a metaphor for. The thing I do think is sort of interesting, and he touches on it. I think he, even in his attempt to address it, whitewashes it a lot. How, Godzilla sort of evolves, right? In his evolution into this almost cultural hero, right? It's part of it is, the Japanese scientists, with their technological discoveries, sort of saving the world from an American technological terror, right? And one of the things that this article does address, like, well, hold on, it's like the technology, your science that you got all this from, y'all did some pretty sketchy things too during World War II, and this is one of those things that I find it interesting because, like I said, post 2000, we get a lot of new Toho driven Japanese Godzilla films. And one of them actually kind of addresses this a little bit, saying, hey, Godzilla is a vengeful spirit on us for our crimes during World War II, what we did during World War II. And there's, I can't remember, I think it's a separate movie, but essentially it's also this against political corruption with how they've behaved. So it's like, it became this cultural sort of mascot, but post 2000, they're going back to saying, we did a lot of dirty stuff during World War II also. And people are really coming to terms with how whitewashed Japanese, the Japanese have been culturally from our perspective. Like, we were happy to make the Germans the bad guys in every single movie that's ever been made since World War II. And we were happy to show them as barbaric and inhuman. But even when we do movies, World War II films about the Japanese front during World War II, there's always this sort of fine culture to them, and they're honorable. And it's like, guys, these, like, during World War II and before, the Japanese military committed some of the worst atrocities in the entire war.
Absolutely.
And so some of these later 2000, post 2000 movies kind of started addressing those things as well. They're like, hey, we're not the angels in this story either, right? We do, this was one of those, it's interesting how he starts off as this catharsis, and again, a lot to be cathartic about, right? Nagasaki, Hiroshima, firebombing of Tokyo. I mean, there was a lot of trauma that happened to Japan during World War II, and Godzilla sort of being that vehicle to move forward that healing, right? Yeah. Thank you, Texas Jack. That's where I was going. And it's one of those things where, as he evolves culturally, the conversation Japan has about itself is changing with him, right? Because you have that sort of late 60s to late 70s era where this is where we get all the sort of team up movies. We get Jet Jaguar. We have him teaming up with Ultraman. Where he's sort of the hero, and that theme continues for a while. Where with a lot of movies where Godzilla is actually the hero of the story. He's defending Japan from these other monsters, right? He's this heroic spirit. But then, and that's sort of Japan saying, hey, we can do this, right? We can develop, we can become an economic powerhouse. We can become a technological powerhouse, which we see in those 70s and 80s films where, they're building Mechagodzilla, right? They're piloting it. They're building all these super whiz-bang rays to fight them off, even though they don't really work. But it's like, here's all this super high technology we, the Japanese people, are creating to confront Godzilla or these other monsters, right? If need be. There was a question about a smog monster. There was a smog monster, right? Where it's like, that's the pollution thing, right? To Joe Fox's point, like we confront, so it's Godzilla becomes that conversation with, becomes Japan's conversation with itself about who and what it is, right? And what they want to be as a culture. And then post 2000, that conversation evolves to be a little more nuanced, right? About, they start addressing, hey, we can kind of address some of the things we did in World War II, and we weren't the good guys, right? It was in many ways, it was easy for them to focus on this horrible thing that happened to them in 1954, and that was worth going through. But now they can sort of say, look, this wasn't just some random thing that occurred to us. We did bring this on ourselves, and we need to come to terms with that also. Which kind of brings us to Shin Godzilla, right? Which is, particularly at the time, that is them dealing with Fukushima. Real quick, I went ahead and pulled these up. And I know you're probably going to have a lot to say about Shin Godzilla, because it's if 1954, which is this one, right? Again, the keloid scars and all that, it doesn't really read as a keloid scar to us, right? Because we don't have that in our minds. But then you get to Shin Godzilla, and this is clearly a creature in pain, right? I mean, this is a creature who's suffering from a condition. Like, it's very clear that this is a tortured creature that they're facing. And it and when you were watching with your daughter, were you amazed by how much time they spend on the politics in that film?
Yeah, I found it was interesting compared to, say, a Hollywood disaster movie where you're very conscious in a Hollywood type film that there's one or two or a handful of clear heroes who are, dealing with it.
Hmm.
But in this, there was, this bureaucracy had to talk to this bureaucracy, had to talk to
Yeah.
this country, had to try to do this deal. And it was, in a way, at first it was kind of annoying. It was almost like watching, I don't know, a bad political mock doc or something. But
Yeah.
when you start to get into the rhythm of it, because somebody who's not used to watching, although I'm used to a lot of different cinema, I'm certainly not used to watching disaster movies that feel like I'm watching, a
Mm.
faux documentary on the bureaucracy of Japan or something. But
Yeah.
after a while, when you readjusted to that being the way this story was being told, it became a really interesting story. And I do
Yep.
think, though, as much as you're right about the Fukushima, I still think in that movie, as opposed to some of those mid-range Godzilla movies you were talking about, I think they're looking
Yeah.
back again. At least this was my impression. I watched them before I
Hmm.
read that article. It felt to me like it was a return in some ways to the themes of that first Godzilla. Like
Oh, it absolutely
America and
is.
the rest of the world are kind
Hmm.
of the bad guys, and they're kind of bossing Japan around, and Japan doesn't want to
Yeah.
drop a nuclear bomb on its own territory because it's happened to them before, so they're fighting the Americans, and
Hmm.
it's only because a Japanese American daughter of a senator who's going to be the next president of the United States, she happens to be Japanese American, can somehow do a deal with them, and France helps them a little bit. And so you're right about all of this type of intrigue, but it returns again to the idea of
Hmm.
Japan being trod on by America. Like there's even a line in there,
Yeah.
we're like a tributary to America or something. They're really mad
Yep.
about it. So they're still dealing with that post World War II status in this movie. That's what it
Oh,
felt like to
absolutely.
me.
No, and you're right. Like that's definitely a part of the math on that. Like it really is, and it's not like they. And again, it's fair because in many ways they did become a vassal state post World War II, right? And it's even to this day, like there's a lot that, which is why that's there, right? That's absolutely part of the story. But with the end, and again, the scene where he's finally become Godzilla as we would know him, right? Because in the movie, if you haven't seen Shin Godzilla, again, spoilers, um, but he's evolving throughout the entire film. He starts off as this sort of aquatic thing, and he's every time we see him, he's evolving faster and faster into a form we recognize as Godzilla. And when he starts his atomic breath, he's vomiting this fire at first onto the city. And there's a scene where he's walking through and it pans all the way out. And again, like the first movie, right, where you have these, where you see the flames, the entire city is in flames. And again, it's meant to, and again, it does absolutely harken back to World War II, which is the firebombing of Tokyo and just the pain. But of course, at the end, when they resolve the situation, he's not gone. He's there. He's ever present. And again, the whole Fukushima thing is the political intrigue, because that was one of the big complaints from a lot of the Japanese people during the Fukushima event. It was, hey, we've got a real emergency over here. Why are y'all lollygagging? Like a lot of people looked at this and said, y'all are just, y'all need to be on the spot here. This is a serious situation. And so the end of the film, he's not destroyed off somewhere like he was in the first one. He's literally, like, if I recall, it was Tokyo. He's literally in the middle of Tokyo, frozen. And he's there. Just like Fukushima is. Fukushima's still there. It will always be there as this sort of living embodiment of what was going on. So that's why it's like, that's why I say it does harken. It's focusing on the Fukushima event, not that it doesn't address the World War II stuff, but in the same way, it's doing the same thing the original Gojira did, where it was saying, hey, we're going to deal with this national tragedy, this national event, this national trauma. And Shin Godzilla comes right back around and says, we're going to address the same thing and deal with it in this way and this event specifically. But yes, it absolutely does call back to World War II, with a lot of it.
I think it's worth mentioning too that Godzilla fits within the broader genre of science fiction
Mm-hmm.
that the famous critic and writer and political activist Susan Sontag famously called The Imagination of Disaster in her 1965
Yes.
essay, which is probably one of the most significant film criticism essays of the 20th century. It's a very significant essay. And Susan
Mhm.
Sontag, whether you like her politics or not, was probably one of the most influential thinkers and critics of the 20th century. And what Sontag essentially says that the movies that come out in the 1950s into the 1960s when she's writing, the science fiction movies, unlike the novels of years past in the science fiction realm, they're not really about
Mhm.
science at all. What
No.
they're really about is disaster and the way
Yeah.
that people in the post-World War II years and into the atomic age are now imagining and thinking about disaster and somehow trying to normalize it within a type of mass culture that's being produced. Now, she doesn't mention Godzilla, as I recall, in that essay, but she does mention the Mysterians, which was directed by the same director of Godzilla, which is a flying saucer invasion movie. And she also mentions Rodan, and she mentions a bunch of other films in that type of kaiju type line. So she was very conscious that these forces signified, as we've been talking about, and this is where I think a lot of this first is written about critically, that it represented the way
Mhm.
we could destroy ourselves in the post-atomic age. And unlike horror previously, which was often about the fear of death of the individual, science
Right.
fiction films become representative of a new existential fear, which is death of the entire civilization or death of the entire species, and a death
Yes.
that can come instantly. There's no predictability to it. If
Right.
the nuclear war starts, bzz, you can be
Yeah.
evaporated. And certainly back in the 50s and 60s, and probably through really into the late
Mhm.
80s, this was a genuine concern for almost the entire planet. So these movies, Godzilla clearly sits within that type of movie. And
Yes.
Sontag also made the point of saying these movies were really about the spectacle of disaster. And that's what we
Mhm.
see in Godzilla. We see these cities just leveled and Godzilla's fire breath destroying things. And
Yep.
very much like in the equivalent, which she mentions that in the 1950s and the 60s, while Ishirō Honda, the director of, again, Godzilla, Mothra,
Yeah.
the
Mhm.
Mysterians, those movies was the Japanese par excellence example. George Powell, who was doing similar alien invasion type, end of the world
Mhm.
type movies in America, he was doing that same type of technique of showing cityscapes destroyed and, you know,
Mhm.
countries on fire. And this was a new way of imagining disaster. And this is
Yes.
very specific to that period in time. So Godzilla is
Yeah.
kind of uniquely Japanese in the sense that it does deal with Japanese feelings of persecution and Japanese feelings of how do you deal with, national identity being this country that came through this terrible crisis at the end of World War
Mhm.
II. But the entire planet at the same time is dealing with these type of ideas that perhaps the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, those bombings really brought home. But all of World War II, like Dresden fire bombings,
Oh, yeah.
Tokyo fire bombings, attacks like on Pearl Harbor, all of these massive
Mhm.
aerial attacks, which were unlike
Yeah.
anything anybody had seen previously in history.
Oh,
And
absolutely.
now with the recognition of the nuclear age, this could all of a sudden drop on anybody's city. The whole planet could be
Yeah.
torched. So you kind of have to understand these movies within that context, I think.
No, you absolutely do. And again, it's, when you go back to the original Gojira, it's very easy now for us to realize, oh, this is what's going on. But we see a lot of that really, and again, a lot the science fiction of Japan, particularly when we get to anime, right? In the later animes, it's always Neo Tokyo or New this, or it's always a city that's been rebuilt after some tragic earth-ending thing, right? The Gundam series works the same way, where there's been this terrible event and humanity's had to come back together to fight this. Akira, right? Again, Neo Tokyo, flattened by the original Akira, and they're rebuilding it, and it's just it's this constant idea of there was a destructive event and we've built beyond this, but now we're fighting against the new omnipresent fully destructive uh event. And usually though within there though is within whatever the destructive event is, there is this rebirth aspect to it in some way, like with Akira, where it's it was destructive, but it was also because it was the birth of a new thing. With And again, we see it in going back to Godzilla for just a moment. While it's not seen in that movie specifically, his evolution is that conversation of, yes, Godzilla is this highly destructive force that symbolizes the atomic age, but there's also positives to the, yes, he is a terrible, force, and yet he can also be our friend. He can be the thing that protects us from the aliens, or this other monster that's also similarly powered, right? Becomes very much a metaphor for the Cold War, where it's both. So it's really oh, well, thank you. I don't really have much of an accent as far as I'm concerned, but I am from Texas. So yeah, there's that evolution. But yeah, you're absolutely right. We see these movies in the 50s and 60s of just how quickly life can end. And you didn't see those things even in literature really before that, because the idea of wiping out whole civilizations was an impossibility until that event. It's like, oh, we can just wipe everything out. And that's a real fear that hadn't really been considered to that point. So yeah, absolutely right.
And there's been a desensitization, which I think was Sontag's point as well. Like when you watch the first Avengers movie, for example, and aliens are just destroying New York City and superheroes are knocking down buildings. And we've been so desensitized to the idea of that. And when you look at really genuine events, like the numbness from September 11, for example, I wonder how much. I mean, I was shocked. That devastated me, as I think most people who were watching that news report are devastated. But I wonder how much we'd already been used to that imagery from movies like Fight Club, for example, or movies like Godzilla or whatever, where buildings are being brought down. We have, in a way, been enculturated to expect disaster. Yeah, these movies have done it, really.
Oh, they have. Well, and in a way, they're also sort of that. Again, going back to the idea of Godzilla being catharsis, a lot of these movies are just that. They are catharsis from these events. One of them, I think, actually, and I was listening to somebody. It was. I'll remember later. I can see the image. I can see their logo. But they were talking about how the Kelvin timeline Star Trek films, right? The new Star Trek films that came out, where the original Star Trek was sort of set as this hopeful, future. Goes, all these three films are very much in a post 9/11 world, right? And if the other films were sort of these bigger things, it's like, imagine what one person can do with this technology, right? In the first film, it's the red matter, right? Just this one lone group of Romulans has this weapon of mass destruction that they can use to wipe out whole planets. In the second one, it's Khan, right? So there's this, and even the third one are just a handful of surviving former Federation officers who lost their way and got their hands on this super weapon, and now are coming to wreak vengeance on their own people for leaving them out to die. It's like, this is all very post 9/11, to your point, and where it's like, it's not just that, hey, the future can be super bright because of all this cool technology. It's the future can be terrifyingly dangerous because of this super technology, and to a point, the people we leave behind, right? Because all in a way, all of the villains of these three Kelvin timeline movies are, in one way or another, victims of society sort of leaving them behind in one way or another. For the Romulans, it was the fact that Spock couldn't save Romulus, right? With Khan, it was the fact that Khan had been found and restored, but then the Federation was using him to make weapons, and they weren't going to give him his people back. And the third one, these were people that these were sold, officers who worked for the Federation, who worked for Starfleet, but they essentially got abandoned by their own people, right? So those are themes that sort of run throughout those films, and it's very post 9/11. This is not how Gene Roddenberry would have thought about any of these situations, but it's how, for those of us who watch those towers fall and have dealt with everything in post 9/11, and we've seen soldiers come home and essentially be abandoned by our own government, and sort of, just left to go be homeless. And, for those of us whose fathers came back from Vietnam, I recognize that, right? My father was in Vietnam. There's a lot of things he doesn't talk about. Well, he didn't talk about. He's passed now, but I see that in a lot of friends that I had who went off and came back, and there's things they won't talk about, and there's trouble with the VA. A lot of them don't. If they can avoid the VA, they avoid it entirely. So, in the same way, we're to your point, working these ideas out, and maybe to the point expecting these future traumas, these future disasters as inevitable through film. We're having that conversation through film.
I think so. I mean, I think sometimes there's themes which are intentionally for political purposes interjected into modern films, but there's also just writers who are working these things out themselves, who are living in the same culture that we are, who aren't somehow able to escape it just because they're writers. So they're dealing with the same type of problems which face us. And one of those problems was in the past an existential threat to the end of humanity, as it probably still is to a degree, but we'll continue to deal with those type of crises which face us within science fiction. That's the real strength of science fiction, and the real strength of this type of movies is that they can deal with those things in a metaphorical or an allegorical type way.
Yeah. No, and it's, again, going back to Godzilla for a moment, it's interesting how when you get that middle sort of, late 60s to the, before, 2000 Godzilla, where he's sort of the hero in these movies.
Well, there was an American cartoon, right, where Godzilla was the hero. Wasn't there there were kids who called him up and he helped them or something, and they had a little baby. I can only vaguely remember it, but it was a total comic book version of Godzilla.
Oh, absolutely was. Yeah, and he was. I loved that show. Godzuki was the kid. He could fly. I don't know where that came from, but yeah, Hanna-Barbera did that. I love that series. I caught a little bit on, back when we had syndicated television, and all that. But like they had them at my Blockbuster. I would rent them all the time. I loved that growing up as a kid. But yeah, he was the hero. Well, and a lot of those things that he's fighting, in a lot of the monsters that he fights are things like the smog monster, which is pollution, right? They're fighting aliens. He's fighting, which is the other, right? So he becomes the hero and sort of that symbol of Japan taking what had been a bad thing, adopting it, claiming it as their own, because they did adopt nuclear power and said, hey, we can use this to make us stronger. We can make ourselves the heroes. We can let us show our innovation in these films where, again, Japan is fielding all these super technologically advanced weaponry and craft and all kinds of things, right? And each movie, and really you see this a lot post 2000. Each movie's kind of its own standalone thing. Like sometimes they'll call back to like the original 1954 film, but like that's it. Everything else is sort of its own little story. They don't all necessarily tie together. They did in the 60s and 70s, right? There was that sort of running, hey, sort of like a Marvel universe kind of a thing where they're all sequels of the same thing. But then once we get into like the 80s, 90s, and again, definitely the 2000s, each one essentially is its own unique sequel, with some notable exceptions, but they're their own unique sequel to the 1954 film. They all go back to 1954 and say, that was this, and now this is the next movie. So each one explores a different concept, whether it's pollution or, again, coming to terms with Japan's own sins of the past, and Godzilla sort of, living that out. It's interesting how the films are that conversation. And to your point, if you take that science fiction film genre just a little bit wider, right, beyond just the disaster film, you can argue things like Ghost in the Shell, the original Ghost in the Shell, not the American movie, which is terrible. Again, Akira, these are having that conversation in a very disaster film way, but they're having that conversation about where are we going as a people with technology. What is technology taking, this pursuit of technology, is it taking us somewhere we really want to go? Is this really what we want to be? And addressing it. It's like, hey, what are the dangers of adopting all this stuff so quickly, abandoning the old ways? Like, what are the dangers here? Where are people going to be left behind? Where is the next Godzilla coming from? What is it going to look like?
No, I think you're right on all those things. Something on a slightly different tack, which might be worth hitting to fire off on another angle, is we mentioned before how these kaiju films kind of fit within that broader scope of the imagination of disaster that Sontag spoke about. And in Japan, you got a lot of those monster movies doing. You also got some source movies like the Mysterians, for example.
Right.
But in America, of course, the imagination of disaster often appeared in flying saucer films. Earth versus the Flying Saucers, for example, or even The Day the Earth Stood Still. There's the threat of the aliens coming back and turning us into a burnt out cinder if we continue in it with our, atomic foibles or whatever the Michael Rennie speech is at the end of that movie. But what fascinates me as a cultural historian who's been focused on UFO belief for so long is obviously nobody's suggesting that there's a real Godzilla. Godzilla never got attached to an actual cryptozoological phenomenon. This high-rise size monster that really lurked in the Pacific could come up.
Don't think we haven't tried.
I'm sure you have. But it's interesting that here in America and in the West, that it really got attached to flying saucers. And you have to ask yourself how much of our interpretation of flying saucers today, how much of the narrative of UFO belief is inseparable from that imagination of disaster which was fueling the kaiju movies in Japan, and in the United States it was fueling the flying saucer movies. Like, you get Michael Rennie warning us about, to stop our nuclear foibles, and you get Adamski being told essentially the same thing, by the UFO contactees were being warned about as well. You get the idea that a hostile invasion of extraterrestrials might actually genuinely be happening. There are ufologists who still today talk about alien invasion. David Jacobs, for one, the late Bud Hopkins for another, who thought that the alien abduction phenomenon was just kind of, the advanced force of this coming, invasion. So we don't take the Godzilla narrative as anything other than metaphor for the dangers of living in a post-nuclear world, right? But we don't often look at flying saucer belief, at least not people within the UFO community. Academics do. But we don't often look at that belief system and go, how much of these things that I believe about flying saucers is a result of the cultural crises, the technological crises, the existential crises that we were facing as a species post-World War II into the Cold War?
No, that's a really great question, because you're right. I mean, during the Cold War, we had the threat of nuclear annihilation and that's very much the theme of a lot of these UFO films. It's here is this technologically advanced thing, because that has the ability to wipe us out one way or the other. Because while there are definitely like Forbidden Planet, where that's not really the theme, the simple fact of the matter is it's still technology facing against this other thing that we can't really see, we can't really address directly, and poses this existential threat, because we were at a time of I mean, it's hard to even imagine, if you were in your 30s at that point, all the change you had seen, much less your 50s. If you were born in 1901, right, what you had seen by the time you get to 1954 and you're 53, right, the things that you're seeing, that you've seen change in your lifetime is unimaginable. And so the idea of the UFO being the symbol of high technology, because where Japan was dealing with the trauma of being bombed, right, it was easier for them perhaps to embody that in a creature, because it's really more about the pain of what had occurred than anything else. For the US, right, it was we would be the ones doing the bombing, as well as being bombed. So we couldn't really escape the technological aspect of it. So that's why the UFO sort of became that stand-in for the Russians. And it was this threat of high modernity, of high technology, being able to do that. So yeah, I think there's no way to avoid the UFOs as sort of the metaphor for that, to work those ideas out and those concepts out. There was really no way to do that. And you're right. I don't think most people realize how those films influence how we view the UFO phenomena. You're right, because I mean, it's, don't get me wrong, cryptozoologists have tried. We tried to come up with the real Godzilla, because we do want there to be a giant 300-foot radioactive monster beneath the waves. I know I do. So long as it doesn't come here. But it's you couldn't, for the US and during that period, you really couldn't avoid that, right? That's sort of the technological aspect of it and how that affects. Well, we've talked about here on previous episodes with the Betty and Barney Hill thing, right? Before the Betty and Barney Hill event became popularized, the occupants of UFOs were varied wildly. And even the initial descriptions that Betty and Barney Hill give are very different. And then they sort of become the gray aliens we know, and that's what gets popularized. Now everyone sees the gray alien. A lot of the themes of, like you said, UFOs saying, hey, you're going to destroy yourselves with these nuclear weapons, that sort of becomes a theme that we see in ufology a lot for years, all through the Cold War, through it.
And it's still there. If you look at Jacques Vallée's most recent book with Paola Harris, Trinity, the Best Kept Secret, and the Roswell mythology, by the way, both of these are predicated that a UFO crashes near either where our original Trinity nuke testing was done in the case of Vallée's book, or in the later Roswell story, where outside of the Roswell Army airfield, where essentially our nuclear Air Force or Army Air Force battalion would fly out with the nukes back then. So both of those stories became attached to the idea of the nuclear age. So many warnings that abductees and contactees and others have come across with the aliens telling them, don't nuke yourselves, we're here to stop you nuking yourselves. Or how many stories are there about flying saucers going around, nuclear bases, or turning off the rocket systems of a nuclear base? All of these tales tie so much into our preoccupation with the nuclear reality, the existential threat which it posed post World War II throughout the Cold War, that it's as attached as Godzilla is. It's just, we look at Godzilla as, okay, that's just a movie, right? That's just a monster movie. But when we look at UFO movies that say the same thing as Godzilla said, but perhaps from a slightly more American perspective, but then when UFO belief is saying the same things as well, very few people within the community go, it's kind of weird. I think the same way UFOs as the Japanese think about Godzilla. Now, academics realize that, who were outside of the community, but people within the community don't spend a whole lot of time wondering how much do the cultural pressures of the day influence our belief system. Yeah.
No, that's a great point. I think one of the reasons for that is, well, sort of the obvious nature of it, right? We do have UFOs. And of course, we've talked ad nauseum about how there's definitely the government wants us to focus on that as well, whereas there really isn't some giant Leviathan out there to sort of pin that on. Also, let me throw the original 1954 Godzilla back up there. I don't know if y'all can see his face as much, but like he's got almost cat-like ears, right? He doesn't have a reptilian nose; he has a snout. Like he's very much modeled on the traditional Asian dragon, which has sort of chimeric imagery on it, right? It has, it's not a purely reptilian thing. It has cat features to it. It has these other attributes to it. So it's automatically sort of this chimeric metaphorical creature. And they drew from that when they designed Gojira, when they designed that costume and the puppets. He's very much influenced by traditional Japanese depictions of a dragon. So they already have it sort of front loaded with an older historical mythological system that they can tie it into. Whereas the UFO is a brand new, while you and I completely agree, I think a lot of people watching this agree that yes, the modern UFO and abduction phenomena clearly harkens back to what you would call the Fae and many of these other phenomena in the past. The imagery of it, the iconography of it, is a purely modern thing, right? There isn't anything connecting us back to older sort of systems that we recognize as metaphorical.
Which just happens to drop on us at the end of World War II and the start of the Cold War as well, incidentally.
Exactly. Yeah. Just happens to.
And of course, the ufologists have turned that into their own advantage as well, saying, well, the aliens from outer space saw we detonated those atomic blasts, so they came here. Would they really care? Why would they care? I mean,
can't help. Yeah. Well, and also the CIA is created
of course,
the same year.
But I mean, would an ET from
Roswell.
another star system really care if a nuclear detonation happened on Earth? What? But the idea that
if there are
somehow
space
they're
brothers,
all, I know that kind of. Let's assume there is extraterrestrial life, and I quite frankly don't. But this kind of idea that they'd be so concerned about us, they'd come here from Zeta Reticula to warn us of the nuclear danger. I mean, it's so obviously culturally driven, is my point. It's so obvious that this UFO phenomenon, the modern UFO phenomenon, cannot be separated from the reality of the post-war power balance with the America and the Soviets pointing off at each other with these incredible weapons that could, end life as we know it. We understand that's what Godzilla's about. We just don't want to admit that that's what a lot of the UFO iconography is about. That's my only point.
Well, no. And I think, and again, it kind of goes back to 2 points, which is one, there's the visual connection Godzilla has to an older mythology, and combined with the fact that there isn't some giant 300-foot, reptile, swimming around the ocean, whereas there are strange, aerial phenomena and abductions and all that.
Right, and it's easy to attach that belief system to Venus misinterpreted, or to a weather balloon, or to the Fae, or to a ghost light, or to a U-2 plane. As we know, the CIA said 60% of the UFO reports that they studied from the period they were testing the U-2 and other planes was just misidentification of American craft. So there are things in the sky that you can attach a belief to. You're right, there's no great old dragon rising out on Tokyo Bay, so you can't attach your fears to that. You have to do it directly through the movies. But here we could do it through the movies, and those things which were taught to us in the movies by again Michael Rennie, that's why the aliens are here. Then the contactees started saying that, and then the abductees started saying that. So there was a phenomenon that you could attach it to. There was nothing you could attach Godzilla to. Maybe if all of a sudden there was some weird phenomenon which rose out of the sea, there would have been, there really is a Godzilla. But of course, there isn't anything like that to attach it to.
So. Oh, exactly. And it's like, it'd be one thing if we were all out one day and just, it would be like, whoa, what just happened, right? But like even in the film, like there's a scene in the film, early on in the film, where a fisherman's boat is destroyed by Gojira. And again, we don't really see it, but it happens. Again, that happened in the film. It was filmed before the event, but like just before in 1954, when the movie comes out, there was a Japanese fisherman's boat that was destroyed because of atomic testing in the Bikini Atolls. Like that, it wasn't just something that happened in the past. It was something they were actively living with. It's like, hey, these are just some fishermen who got blasted out of the water because in the wrong place at the wrong time with this thing. So because it was such an obvious metaphor for the atomic age and atomic weapons specifically, again, and there was no, it was really easy for them not to connect it. But you're absolutely right. This is not a conversation that's usually had in a lot of in ufology. Is sort of, hey, why do we see this connection here? What? Because my favorite phrase, again, as an the student of archaeology that I am, and anthropology, is culture is the water that you swim in, right? Fish don't know they're wet.
That's great.
That's the problem with culture, is you don't often realize how much of what you're even the ideas in your head, the preconceptions you have that you're basing and interpreting something from is entirely culturally based. And we don't even really consciously realize how dependent we are on those cultural norms and concepts, so that we just sort of, they're just there. And we never even stop to second guess and say, well, hold on, how much of this is coming from this stuff here?
And
Because
the reason it makes
Mhm.
such sense to us is because it does fit the culture we're raised in. So of course the ETs
Yeah.
are here to warn us against the nuclear age, because that's what bothers us so much. It's obvious that's why they're here, but we
Yep.
don't separate. Well, what we are believing about the ETs seems very dependent upon our exact moment in a cultural space now. So,
Yeah.
but that's the reason it makes so much sense to us. And it's the exact same reason that we should question why it makes so much sense to us.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we talked about this when we went over Chariots of the Gods, right? Is, Von Daniken's explanation when he goes to scriptures and, says, oh, here's a visitation at Sinai and here's Ezekiel. And they look, and again, very much cherry picking which lines he's going to use. But he's like, this looks so much like, again, Sinai. This looks like a Titan rocket, right? Ezekiel, again, very much cherry picking the text. But this looks like a helicopter, right? It's the technology of the day that he's connecting. And now that we're, basically 60 years past those writing, we've sort of dropped a lot of those ideas without realizing, well, hold on. If they were using the technology of the 1960s and that's what it looked like, they couldn't have gotten here in the first place if they're from Zeta Reticuli or some other distant star. Like, it's because because we have a culture of where we're dealing with quantum teleportation. We have sci-fi that has, anti-gravity and wormholes and all this other, like, our culture has advanced. It's allowed the aliens to advance with them, right? Because again, a lot of those very early abductees, they described technology that looked like
Absolutely.
technology of the day. It was sci-fi technology for the day, but for us, that looks primitive. The original Star Trek looks stupidly primitive to us today, with the exception of warp speed, the transporter, and the phasers, and of course the shields. With those four exceptions, everything in the original Star Trek series we've beaten, and we've done it better than they have. Right? There's stuff even in like DS9 in the Next Generation, right? That they have that we've done better in the modern age. So in fact, we're having to go back and rewrite some stuff because that stuff seems primitive to us now. So in the same way, we've kind of rewritten the rules of the UFO based on what's in our sci-fi now. And we've sort of forgotten, oh, hey, why is it the UFOs are evolving exactly the same rate we are? Why is their technology just whatever seems to be in the sci-fi movie this year?
Well, look at the great airship of 1896 and 1897, which flew over
Yep.
America. It looks like a steampunk airship today when you look at the pictures of it
Oh,
or read the
absolutely.
description of it. Things with wings and balloons and the steam engines, but that's
Mm-hmm.
because that was a Jules Verne culture. It was the
Yeah.
expectation of what heavier than air travel would actually look like. So it had all these weird notions attached to it.
Mm-hmm. Oh,
And
absolutely.
the same way that then when where we are today, or where we were with Von Daniken, it was like, a lunar
Mm-hmm.
mission rocket ship, or
Mm-hmm.
where we are today, it's like this tic-tac drone thing that bops around everywhere. It just keeps
Yeah.
pace slightly ahead of where we're at, but
Yep.
culturally
And
bound, all of it.
but always culturally bound. Y'all have got some a couple of great questions I wanted to hit before we left. Again, going back to our favorite 300 foot tall radioactive lizard. Horace asks, in the U.S., who was the audience for the original Godzilla in the 1950s, kids or adults? The original 1954 film was very much for adults, like, and I think this is also one of those things we tend to forget. A lot of things would be considered like family, like, so it wasn't necessarily aimed. It definitely wasn't aimed at kids, right? But it was for the adults. But a lot of kids did end up going. Now in the 60s and 70s and in the 80s, what happens is when we start getting the more, because again, the original Godzilla is, I think, like a PG rating, Like, it's not even PG-13. It's like PG, because there's nothing in it that's really objectionable. So once, as it came over to television, that's when we start getting the association of Godzilla being a more kid-friendly and oriented thing, is those later films. But again, the original film was, again, it was targeted for adults, but it was never objectionable for kids to observe either. So again, I think what the problem is, this goes back to the culture. Like, we think about it differently. Texas Jack, going back to the 2014 Legendary, where unfortunately Walter White did not fight Godzilla. I was waiting for that, him standing in his underwear. You're Godzilla, right? Anyway, Texas Jack says, I will say the Halo jump in 2014 movie was beautiful cinematography, though. Yes. The thing about that movie that I really, really loved is it's very much observing Godzilla from the human perspective, right? It's from this perspective of the people around him. And I love that, because you really don't get an objective view like we get with most other movies. And so it really makes him feel much larger, much more powerful. And I agree, that Halo jump scene is one of my favorite scenes in any monster film. Again, I like the movie. I kind of like the modern stuff. I prefer the Japanese stuff, but that scene alone is one of the best scenes in any monster film ever made. And Horace Smith with the geek question that you knew I was going to love. The oxygen destroyer, which is the thing that's used to destroy Godzilla in the original 1954 film, has some ambiguities to whether or not it's good or bad. And that's the thing, right? Horace is 100% correct. In that 1954 film, the oxygen destroyer is not necessarily seen as a good thing. In fact, it's kind of painted as a terrible thing needed to destroy a terrible thing, right? Even though it's, the hero is the scientist who developed it, right? It's the Japanese scientist who developed it, which is where a little bit of the whitewashing comes in, where it's like, I recognize that this is a danger, and I'm going to use it, but I want to go down and I want to die with it, so no one could make this weapon again, right?
And incidentally, it's a very Japanese kamikaze divine wind kind of ending as well. Like, we'll go to the death for the emperor. Now, doesn't say that, but it's the same kind of morality.
Same concept. Yeah, exactly. It's the same. That same idea, sort of the kamikaze mission, but it's also like they paint him to be the hero, even though he's developed this terrible weapon. But he's like, I'm going to sacrifice myself so no one else can make it, which is in contrast to the U.S. continually testing nuclear weapons in the Pacific, which is what created Godzilla to begin with. So it's, again, like I said, even the article kind of whitewashes that, but he at least addresses the fact that it's like, you're kind of throwing some hypocritical themes here, Japan, with this. How dare you test this nuclear weapon? We're going to completely, ignore Unit 741, right? At least I think it's 741. My dyslexia kicks in from time to time.
I know what you mean.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, okay, it's like, okay. At least the article addressed it. But yes, so the oxygen destroyer, the scientist is good, but it is seen as a terrible weapon being used to destroy a terrible weapon. So yeah, there is some ambiguity. Again, it is more nuanced. That is the one thing about Asian cinema I love very much, is why I'm a huge fan of anime. Particularly, again, Ghost in the Shell, the series, was my favorite thing. You have to find the original. They have this new stuff on Netflix. It's terrible. But it's the nuance, right? Very few characters are good. Very few are purely good. Very few characters are purely bad. And a lot of the situations are nuanced, where it's like, hey, maybe where you have to ask if there's more going on here, right? It's not just the simple, let's go blow up the Death Star. There's there is some ambiguity. I think part of it comes to the fact that the Japanese sort of understand, hey, we weren't the good guys in World War II, that's not who we were. They've kind of had to, again, they weren't vilified the way the Germans were in later cinema and film and culture. But there is some minor, at least, recognition that they're like, okay, we weren't the good guys either here. So but again, I love the geek questions, being the geek that I am. So the fact that we're going to talk about the oxygen destroyer makes me happy. Thank you for putting up with this episode. This was for me, honestly. Dane was like, I have nothing to do with this. Nothing to
do with me at all.
This is all Jason. I was like, he's like, what do you want to talk? I'm like, I'm talking about Godzilla. Okay. I mean, it was he didn't. I didn't have to break his arm to do the subject, but yeah, this one was all me. I just wanted to have some fun with this one, and I love Godzilla. At some point, I'll rope the X-Men into it.
Gosh, I might draw the line of the X-Men. I don't know. We'll see. Maybe we'll do one on Wolverine or something sometime. I don't know.
Oh, I'll find a way. I'm
sure you will. I have little doubt about that. Well, and that week will be in the comic book wing of the Mysterious Library.
Yes. Yeah, we've been, with all the documentaries and stuff we've been doing, it's like we've been stuck in the film section, and not just because I love the popcorn that the elves make, but you know, you've got Midwest Weird Fest coming up.
That's true. We've been looking at a number of films which will be screening at Midwest Weird Fest, which is at the Mike on Downtown Cinema, March 3 to 5. My goodness, that's so close now.
Oh, yeah.
It's less than a month away. And we've done some of those films. We still have a couple more that we're going to do as well. So we might be back in the documentary wing a couple more times, in the audio-visual wing of the library over the next month.
Yes. No, looking forward to it. Again, I know you've been working crazy hard on this on Midwest Weird Fest, and I know you are going to be very relieved once it's over.
Oh my goodness, I am. But I love it. The weekend, those 3 days I've run a lot of film festivals in my life, but those 3 days are just a joy. When you get there, it's a joy. I will be glad when it's over because it's a lot of work to get there, but I won't be glad when I'm there for those 3 days and those 3 days are over, because meeting the filmmakers, hanging with the audience, screening some of the most offbeat and wonderful weird cinema in the world for 3 solid days in the beautiful downtown area of Eau Claire. It's just a great joy. And you're coming next year, Jason. I'm not going to hold you to it this year, but next year you're coming.
No, next year I will be there. Unfortunately, this year got really weird with work, for what are quite obvious reasons. But yeah, next year I will be there. I will plan it out. You couldn't keep me away.
Can't wait. And until then, man, you might as well sign us out. You sign us out better than I do.
Well, again, for everyone in chat, everyone watching on replay, we really appreciate y'all. Y'all are the reason we do this. The show's a lot of fun. Y'all are a lot of fun. We love hanging out with y'all. And so we'll be back here next week. We're going to be talking about some other wild and crazy thing. And we'll be doing it. So we'll catch y'all behind the card catalog. See ya.